Hey there, history buffs. Ever wonder if there's more to the American Revolution than what we learned in school? Well, grab a cup of coffee and settle in, because we're about to explore some fascinating revelations that might just change how you think about the birth of the United States. I recently came across this book, The True History of the American Revolution, by Sidney George Fisher. Now, I know what you're thinking. Another Revolutionary War book? But trust me, this one's different. Fisher wrote this back in 1902, and he dug deep into primary sources to paint a picture of the Revolution that's far more nuanced than our usual tale of plucky patriots versus British tyrants. What's really interesting is how Fisher challenges so many of our assumptions. He looks at the economic motivations behind the revolt, the significant number of colonists who weren't so keen on independence, and some of the less than heroic tactics used by both sides. But here's the thing that really caught my attention: Fisher's take on British General Howe. Without spoiling too much, let's just say Howe's actions during the war raise some eyebrows when you look at them closely. Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to explore these ideas and more. We'll look at how the revolution wasn't just about lofty ideals of liberty, but also about trade restrictions and taxes. We'll discuss the crucial role of France, without which American independence might never have happened. This isn't about debunking everything you know. It's about adding depth and complexity to our understanding of this pivotal moment in history. By the end, I think you'll have a new appreciation for just how messy, complicated, and human the birth of the United States really was. So, ready to dive into the true story of the American Revolution? Let's get started. All right, before we jump into Fisher's revelations, let's quickly recap the version of the American Revolution most of us learned in school. You know, just to set the stage. Picture this. It's the 1770s, and the American colonies are chafing under British rule. We've got heroic patriots standing up for their rights against a tyrannical King George III and his oppressive parliament. Remember learning about the Stamp Act and the cry of no taxation without representation? Then there's the Boston Tea Party, those rebellious colonists dumping British tea into the harbor. Oh, and who can forget Paul Revere's midnight ride? We learned about brave militia standing up to British regulars at Lexington and Concord, and the great General Washington leading his troops through the harsh winter at Valley Forge. The Declaration of Independence gets signed. There's a long, hard-fought war, and eventually the scrappy Americans emerge victorious against all odds. It's a great story, right? Full of heroism, dedication to liberty, and the birth of democracy. And look, there's truth to all of this. These events did happen, and many colonists were indeed fighting for principles they deeply believed in. But here's the thing. This version of the story tends to smooth over a lot of complexities. It doesn't dig into the economic factors at play, or acknowledge that a significant portion of colonists weren't on board with the whole independence idea. And it certainly doesn't explore the possibility that some British leaders might not have been fully committed to crushing the rebellion. That's where Fisher's book comes in. He doesn't completely overturn this narrative, but he does add layers of complexity that make the story far more interesting and far more human. Ready to dig into those complexities? Let's go. All right, let's dive into one of Fisher's most intriguing revelations: the puzzling behavior of British General William Howe. Now, if you're like me, you probably didn't hear much about Howe in your history classes, but his actions, or rather, his inactions, during the early years of the war are seriously eyebrow-raising. Here's the deal. Howe was the commander-in-chief of British forces in America from 1775 to 1777. On paper, he had everything he needed to crush the rebellion. He had a larger army, better-trained troops, and vastly superior resources. And yet, he repeatedly failed to deliver the knockout blow. Take the Battle of Long Island in August 1776. Howe decisively defeated Washington's army, but then, he just stopped. He let the Americans escape across the East River to Manhattan. Fisher points out that Howe could have easily pursued and potentially captured a large part of the Continental Army, including Washington himself. But he didn't. This wasn't a one-off either. Time and again, Howe seemed to pull his punches. He'd win a battle, then fail to follow up. He'd have the Continental Army on the ropes, then back off and let them recover. Now you might be thinking, well, maybe Howe was just incompetent. But here's where it gets really interesting. Fisher suggests that Howe's actions might have been deliberate. You see, Howe was a Whig, part of the British political party that was sympathetic to the American cause. Fisher posits that Howe might have been deliberately holding back, hoping that a few defeats would bring the Americans to the negotiating table without completely crushing them. Is this true? Well, it's hard to say for certain, but Fisher makes a compelling case, and it certainly explains some of Howe's more baffling decisions. If nothing else, it adds a layer of political intrigue to the military history that we don't often consider. So what do you think? Was Howe incompetent or playing a deeper political game? It's something to ponder as we move on to our next revelation. Now let's talk about something that often gets glossed over in our standard Revolutionary War narrative. The colonists were far from united in their desire for independence. Fisher digs into this in fascinating detail. We often picture the colonies as a united front against British tyranny, but the reality was much messier. In fact, a significant portion of the population, Fisher suggests it might have been as high as 1/3, were loyalists who opposed the revolution. These weren't just a few wealthy elites clinging to their connections with Britain. They came from all levels of society: farmers, merchants, clergy, and yes, some government officials too. Many of them sincerely believed that remaining part of the British Empire was in the best interests of the colonies. But here's where it gets really interesting. Beyond the loyalists, there was a large group of colonists who were, well, let's call them ambivalent. They weren't passionate supporters of independence, but they weren't die-hard loyalists either. They were folks just trying to get by, unsure which side to support, or hoping to stay neutral in the conflict. Fisher paints a picture of a society deeply divided, where neighbor sometimes turned against neighbor. In some areas, the revolution looked more like a civil war than a united uprising against foreign rule. This division had real military consequences too. Remember how we talked about General Howe not pursuing Washington's army after certain battles? Well, one reason he might have held back was that he was expecting loyalist uprisings to do some of the work for him. These uprisings largely didn't materialize, but the fact that Howe thought they might shows how divided the colonies really were. It's a far cry from the united front we often imagine, isn't it? And it raises some interesting questions. How did the pro-independence faction manage to prevail when the population was so divided? How did they maintain control in areas with strong loyalist sympathies? These are the kinds of complex questions that Fisher's work brings to the fore. It reminds us that revolutions are messy, complicated affairs, full of uncertainty and conflicting loyalties, and that's what makes them so fascinating to study. All right, let's talk about something that often gets underplayed in American tellings of the Revolution: the absolutely crucial role of France. Now you might be thinking, wait, I know France helped us. But Fisher really drives home just how pivotal French support was, to the point where you have to wonder if independence would have been possible without it. The key moment Fisher highlights is the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. This wasn't just a big win for the Americans, it was a game changer in terms of foreign support. Before Saratoga, the French were hesitant. They liked the idea of causing trouble for their British rivals, but they weren't sure this ragtag American army was worth backing. But Saratoga, that changed everything. Suddenly, the Americans didn't look like such a long shot anymore. Within months of Saratoga, France signed a formal alliance with the United States. And let me tell you, this was no small thing. France didn't just send a few guns and some encouraging notes. We're talking about money, supplies, troops, and most importantly, the French Navy. That naval support was absolutely critical in the later stages of the war, especially at Yorktown. Fisher argues that this French support turned what might have been a slowly failing rebellion into a genuine war for independence. It forced Britain to divert resources to other parts of its empire, worried about French attacks. It gave the Continental Army the supplies and support it desperately needed. And perhaps most importantly, it provided a huge morale boost to the pro-independence faction. Here's a thought that Fisher's work leaves you with. If Burgoyne hadn't surrendered at Saratoga, if the French hadn't seen that proof that the Americans could win, would we be looking at a very different map of North America today? It's a reminder that the American Revolution wasn't just a conflict between Britain and its colonies. It was part of a much larger global struggle, with major European powers playing crucial roles. And it shows how events on a single battlefield in upstate New York could have repercussions that would change the course of world history. Now, let's dive into something that often gets overshadowed by all the talk of liberty and self-governance: the economic motivations behind the American Revolution. Fisher doesn't pull any punches here. He lays out how financial interests played a huge role in pushing the colonies towards independence. Remember learning about no taxation without representation? Well, Fisher argues it wasn't just about political principle. The colonists were genuinely angry about British economic policies that were hitting them in the pocketbook. Take the Navigation Acts, for instance. These laws required colonists to ship certain goods only to England or its colonies, often at below market prices. Then there were taxes on things like sugar, paper, and tea. To us, these might not sound like revolution-worthy offenses, but to colonial merchants and smugglers, they were a big deal. Fisher paints a picture of a colonial economy chafing under these restrictions. He talks about how widespread smuggling was, and how attempts to crack down on it fueled resentment against British authority. But here's where it gets really interesting. Fisher argues that it wasn't just about the taxes and trade laws already in place. Many colonists were worried about what might come next. They feared that if they didn't push back now, Britain would impose even more restrictive economic policies in the future. And then there's the issue of westward expansion. Fisher points out that many colonists, especially big landowners and speculators, were eager to push into Native American territories beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The British, trying to avoid costly conflicts with Native Americans, had restricted this expansion. This didn't sit well with colonists eyeing potentially valuable Western lands. So when we talk about the American Revolution, we're not just talking about lofty ideals of liberty and self-governance. We're also talking about very concrete economic interests, merchants wanting free trade, smugglers protecting their business, landowners and speculators looking to expand westward. It's not as romantic as fighting for freedom, is it? But it's a reminder that revolutions are often driven by a complex mix of ideological and economic motivations. And understanding these economic factors gives us a much fuller picture of why the revolution happened when and how it did. All right, let's tackle a topic that might ruffle some patriotic feathers: the less than noble tactics sometimes used by the pro-independence faction. Fisher doesn't shy away from this, and it's a stark reminder that revolutions, even ones we celebrate, can have a dark side. Now we're all familiar with the heroic image of Minutemen and Continental soldiers. But Fisher paints a more complex picture, showing how intimidation and mob violence played a significant role in the revolutionary movement. Take the treatment of loyalists, for example. Fisher describes numerous instances of tar and feathering, property destruction, and outright physical assault against those who remained loyal to the crown. These weren't just spontaneous outbursts. In many cases, they were organized efforts to silence opposition and pressure fence-sitters into supporting the revolutionary cause. Fisher tells us about loyalists being forced from their homes, having their property confiscated, and in some cases, facing threats to their lives. He argues that this kind of intimidation was a key factor in shifting public opinion towards independence in some areas. But it wasn't just about physical violence. Fisher also delves into the propaganda war. He points out how patriot leaders often exaggerated or even fabricated stories of British atrocities to whip up anti-British sentiment. Remember the Boston Massacre? Fisher suggests that while British soldiers did indeed kill colonists, the event was blown out of proportion and used as a powerful propaganda tool. Now, it's important to note that Fisher isn't saying the British were innocent in all this. They certainly had their share of heavy-handed tactics, but his work challenges us to recognize that the American side wasn't always fighting clean either. This isn't comfortable history. It's a lot easier to think of our founding fathers as purely principled men fighting a just cause. But Fisher reminds us that revolutions are messy, morally complex affairs. People on all sides can find themselves doing things they might not be proud of in the heat of the moment. Understanding this doesn't diminish the achievements of the revolution. If anything, it makes them more impressive. It shows us that the noble experiment of American democracy emerged from a very human, often messy struggle, not from some idealized conflict between pure good and pure evil. So, we've covered a lot of ground here, haven't we? From Howe's puzzling tactics to the divisions among the colonists, the crucial role of France, the economic motivations, and some of the darker aspects of the revolutionary struggle. But you might be wondering, why does all this matter? Isn't this just splitting hairs over events from nearly 250 years ago? Well, I'd argue that this new perspective matters a great deal, and here's why. First off, it provides us with a much more nuanced view of American origins. The revolution wasn't a simple morality play of good versus evil, but a complex political and social upheaval with all the messiness that entails. Understanding this complexity helps us better appreciate the monumental achievement of forming a lasting republic out of such turbulent beginnings. Secondly, Fisher's work illuminates the complexities of political movements and revolutions in general. It shows us how ideological, economic, and personal motivations intertwine. It demonstrates how external factors, like France's intervention, can dramatically alter the course of events. These insights don't just apply to the American Revolution. They can help us understand political movements and conflicts throughout history and even in our present day. Perhaps most importantly, this perspective encourages critical thinking about historical narratives. It reminds us that history isn't set in stone. It's not a collection of facts to be memorized, but an ongoing process of inquiry and interpretation. When we engage with works like Fisher's, we're participating in that process, questioning assumptions and considering new evidence. This kind of critical engagement with history is crucial for a healthy democracy. It helps us understand that our nation, like all nations, has a complex past with moments of both inspiration and disappointment. It encourages us to approach current events and future challenges with the same critical eye, always willing to look deeper and consider multiple perspectives. In the end, Fisher's work doesn't diminish the American Revolution. It enriches our understanding of it. It turns a simple story of triumph into a complex human drama, and in doing so, it makes the ultimate success of the American experiment all the more remarkable. Well, folks, we've taken quite a journey through Sidney George Fisher's The True History of the American Revolution. And I don't know about you, but I'm left with a profound appreciation for just how complex, messy, and fascinating the birth of our nation really was. We've seen how the revolution wasn't inevitable, but the result of a myriad of factors, political, economic, and even personal. We've explored how divided the colonies were, how crucial French support was, and how economic interests played a significant role alongside lofty ideals. Fisher's work challenges us to see the revolution not as a simple tale of heroes and villains, but as a deeply human story. It's a story of people grappling with uncertain times, making difficult choices, sometimes rising to incredible heights of principle and courage, and sometimes falling short of their own ideals. This more nuanced view doesn't diminish the achievements of the revolutionary generation. If anything, it makes them more impressive. Creating a new nation is hard enough when everyone agrees. Doing it in the face of internal division, economic challenges, and a powerful enemy, that's truly remarkable. Now, I want to hear from you. What aspect of the revolution are you inspired to explore further? What surprised you most about Fisher's perspective? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading and responding. If you're intrigued and want to dive deeper, I've put a link to Fisher's book in the description. It's a fascinating read that I highly recommend. And hey, if you enjoyed this journey through revolutionary history, why not join us for more? Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty more historical deep dives coming your way. Remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about how we understand ourselves and our society today. The more we engage with our history, the better equipped we are to face the challenges of our own time. So keep asking questions, keep digging deeper. That's how we honor the legacy of the revolution, not by simplifying it, but by grappling with all its complexity. Thanks for joining me on this historical journey. Until next time, keep thinking critically and never stop exploring the fascinating world of history.